They found gear shredded and stacked like a warning at the mouth of the caves, boots torn open, rucksacks slashed, a scattering of bone fragments that didn't look right to men trained to recognize battlefield damage. That image, repeated by more than one veteran I spoke with, was the beginning of a story that moved from whispered patrol reports to late-night radio interviews, and then into months of heated online debate. According to multiple soldiers who passed the story along, a follow-up team approached those same caves, and before long an enormous figure charged them, and a spear, by witness account, a long, crude spear, ended up embedded in a human body. What happened next, as several sources later described, involved frantic radio calls, a CH-47 Chinook arriving to extract casualties, and the palletizing of a corpse so large it forced people to rethink the definitions of combatant and animal. If you want more deep investigations like this, hit subscribe. Those opening images, the shredded kit, the stacked bones, the sudden charge, are consistent across a cluster of accounts that span years and different roles: infantry team leaders, an anonymous CH-47 pilot interviewed publicly in 2008, FMV and Reaper operators, and a later operator who went by the handle Mr. K in a now-removed 2016 interview. Each source frames the event differently, and the differences matter. In some tellings, the encounter is immediate and chaotic. A small team chasing an objective collapses into a firefight near a canyon rim, then retreats as something unnatural takes the field. In others, the troop sees a large heat signature on a handheld or airborne sensor, approaches carefully, and finds the same shredded belongings and body parts. The common thread is not an identical script, but a pattern. Unusual evidence at cave entrances, a tall thermal or visual contact, and soldiers who report something that by ordinary standards should be impossible. It's important to be deliberate about labels here. The word giant appears in many recountings, sometimes as a shorthand used by the soldiers themselves, and sometimes as a headline writer's choice. But extraordinary terms must always be paired with the speaker's identity or lack thereof. According to an infantry team leader who later discussed the patrol, "We saw something big, nothing like what we'd seen before." That phrasing captures the lived astonishment without turning it into proclamation. When I say according to, it matters who I am quoting: a pilot, an ISR analyst, a trooper on the ground. Each vantage point has its own sensory limitations and biases, which we'll examine, but we can't ignore the consistency that emerges when multiple distinct observers describe a very large humanoid-appearing contact in the same rugged terrain. The first public voice that drew widespread attention was an anonymous CH-47 pilot who spoke on a late-night radio show in 2008.
In his account, he described flying into a pickup zone where a large, tarp-covered form lay on a pallet. He spoke in a calm, measured way. What struck listeners was not theatrical delivery, but the careful detail he offered. The pallet he saw was roughly the size I've seen referenced elsewhere in these accounts, about 9 by 7 feet in dimensions. He described fingers that appeared pasty and long, feet curled up in an unusual posture, measuring in the range of 28 to 30 inches each, according to his visual estimate, and a crew that had to tie the load down in an atypical manner to keep it secure under the Chinook's rotors. He estimated the gross weight in a range that several witnesses later echoed, roughly 1,000 pounds plus, perhaps into the low thousands when including the pallet and packaging, creating an image of a load that would strain conventional handling practices. He didn't embellish. He repeated that his role was to lift and carry, to follow the loadmaster's instructions, and to avoid speculation. That restraint matters, because many reports that follow the path from rumor to unbelievable begin with an emotional reaction and then expand. This pilot's testimony anchored the story in procedural reality. A CH-47 doesn't normally pick up cargo like that, and pilots know what a typical casualty looks like, how bodies handle under rotor wash, and what a standard net load feels like when slung under the aircraft. Still, his figures are eyewitness estimates. Remember, a pilot looking down at a pallet through a bubble of glare and dust must make quick calls. I treat those numbers as reported ranges, not as calibrated measurements taken with forensic tools. A little technical context helps to understand why those visual estimates can vary. A CH-47 Chinook typically uses standard cargo pallets that are a known size. Reference pallets for internal ARF and NATO logistics often cluster around nominal dimensions that can be used to judge scale. But an aerial view, often from above or at an angle, distorts perspective. Dirt and dust kicked up by the rotors, the way a tarp drapes over an oddly shaped mass, and the tendency of human perception to fill in gaps under stress all influence the pilot's reporting. Weight estimates are even trickier from the cockpit. Pilots can sometimes infer weight from how a helicopter handles in hover, but that's subject to variables like altitude, temperature, payload distribution, and whether other slung loads were attached concurrently. So when the pilot described the body as exceptionally heavy, it's a valuable piece of testimony, one grounded in professional observation, but it must be recorded as his professional impression rather than a laboratory-grade measurement. After that 2008 interview, the narrative saw another surge in 2016 with a more graphic, more detailed account attributed to an operator who used the pseudonym Mr. K.
He was not a pilot, but an operator, and by his own framing, someone who had worked with UAV feeds and FMV, full motion video, analysis. Mr. K's contribution to the story was twofold. First, he provided sensory descriptions that a thermal camera would not show, but that ground witnesses later alleged, red hair being the most prominent feature. Second, he spoke of a spear being used in the killing and described a body with anomalous dental formations, claims that, if true, would move the story from an odd military incident into the realm of something biologically unusual. Before we accept those particulars, we have to be careful about what sensors can and cannot tell us. Infrared thermal imaging, a staple of Reaper and Predator operations, registers heat differentials, not color. When an FMV analyst watches a thermal feed, they commonly see a bright white shape against a darker background, or a spectrum from orange to red to black. A thermal camera will show a tall, warm contact, but cannot render hair color or precise superficial textures. Even visible light FMV, depending on sensor resolution and range, can be grainy. Atmospheric distortion and time of day affect what an operator can credibly read. So Mr. K's report that a figure had red hair calls for caution. Either Mr. K saw that detail during a close visible light observation on the ground, which would be significant and worth corroboration, or the description is a recounting of later, closer ground reports that Mr. K was told about. He presented his version as a synthesis of what he had seen and what others had relayed to him. The video he referenced was reportedly pulled from public access, and the absence of extant footage creates the familiar problem that shadows these accounts, a non-traceable testimony, compelling to some, problematic to others. That problem, the disappearance or non-existence of hard media, resurfaces again and again in this story. Multiple sources later reported that certain videos were removed or that analysts were instructed under non-disclosure agreements. I cannot verify NDAs, and anyone asserting they made us sign NDAs should be clear whether they personally signed one or merely heard about such a requirement. What I can note is that the Department of Defense stated it had no record or information supporting a government retrieval of a non-standard corpse from Afghanistan. That statement is in the public record. From the testimony site, however, several veterans independently said their commanders or logisticians counseled silence. Again, an important difference between a formal legal gag order and informal pressure not to talk about a shocking encounter. As the timeline stretches beyond 2016, more voices filter into the narrative: Reaper operators, FMV analysts, and even a lieutenant from Australia who was on picket duty during a separate incident.
A Reaper operator I spoke with in follow-up described seeing small, warm dots clustered and moving in a pattern he interpreted as tending a fire outside a mud compound. Their size relative to the structure suggested tall figures. In another account, an FMV analyst reported watching a silhouette bend to pass through a low doorway, a motion he judged unusual given the apparent height. These witnesses tended to speak in measured, technical language. A thermal contact at about 3 to 4 meters was registered, one operator said, but the pixel spread made precise height difficult to determine. When FMV analysts talk this way, they're signaling both what they observed and the constraints of their tools. Sensors provide strong leads, but they often lack the resolution needed to answer questions about specific biological traits. An Australian lieutenant, described by one correspondent as an on-duty picket, recounted tracking a thermal contact he estimated to be about 12 feet tall at a distance of roughly 1,800 meters. He emphasized the behavior as much as the measurement. The contact moved deliberately across ridgelines in a way that didn't match his experience of local shepherds, wildlife, or shrub patterns. Distances like 1,800 meters are at the outer margins of resolution for many airborne sensors, yet ground observers with optical aids can sometimes make credible range and size estimates. Again, this testimony is valuable but inherently probabilistic. The lieutenant's estimate is his best professional judgment given the tools and conditions at that moment. We should also consider the cultural context that threads through these repeated accounts. Local villages in regions near Kandahar have traditions and practices that include hair dyeing for animals and occasionally for humans during certain celebrations or rituals. Multiple veterans told me they were told by interpreters that goats and even elderly men in some mountain villages used ochre or orange dyes for hair and fur as part of seasonal rites. Such practices can create visual contrasts that a distant observer might misread, particularly in weakened light or through thermal overlays. Additionally, oral local warnings, told to passing soldiers as "stay out of those ridgelines," take on new power once you know the story, and then look at the landscape with that frame in mind. People everywhere tell stories to keep children from wandering into dangerous terrain. Those stories may, in some cases, have origins in real, if misinterpreted, encounters. The detail of red hair that Mr. K or later ground witnesses mentioned intersects uncomfortably with thermal sensor science. Hair dyed bright orange or red by local pastoralists can look striking in visible light, but thermal cameras won't show that color.
That raises two possibilities. Either observers were near enough for visual confirmation, or later retellings folded visible details shared by locals into the broader narrative. Both are plausible, and both change how we weigh the testimony. It's also possible that the red hair detail is culturally salient and therefore easily transmitted. Once one veteran mentions it, the image lodges in other tellings because it offers a vivid, almost folkloric touch. Then there are physical descriptors that are more specific, and because of that, more puzzling. Reports of extra digits, 6 fingers or toes, double rows of teeth, and massive muscular bodies. A handful of sources, speaking in varying degrees of confidence, mentioned hands that had more than 5 digits, or mouths with dental patterns atypical for humans. Those kinds of claims push the narrative beyond the realm of sensor limitations into the biological. They demand either corroborating physical evidence or highly reliable witness testimony from people with direct visual and tactile contact. The most concrete physical claims come from accounts that mention a retrieved body loaded onto a Chinook pallet. If such a body existed and was available for inspection, hospital records, pathology reports, or official inventories should, in theory, offer verification. No such public records are available, and the DoD's public statement offers an absence, not a contradiction. That leaves us in a difficult epistemic position. Multiple oral reports pointing at anomalous biology, but no hard chain of custody evidence in the public domain. Let's step back and consider the cognitive environment in which these testimonies arise. Combat zones create extreme stress. Soldiers operate on cross-modal cues, visual, auditory, tactile, often under threat. Memory research tells us that high stress can distort perceivable details and subsequently alter recall. Even trained observers can misjudge scale or misattribute motion under duress. Another factor is group dynamics. When several soldiers are present at the site of an unusual incident, their accounts can converge over time as they share experiences, sometimes leading to greater consistency, and sometimes to mutual reinforcement of an interpretive frame. That reinforcement creates the social glue that makes oral traditions durable, but it also complicates independent verification. Importantly, many veterans who relate these stories emphasize their discomfort with the more sensational versions. They don't want myths propagated, they want understanding. That restraint is in many ways the signal that we should listen closely, even as we probe skeptically. Technical tradecraft details show up throughout these accounts, and they deserve attention because they also serve as anchors of credibility.
FMV analysts refer to pixel bloom, sensor sampling rates, and the effects of atmospheric distortion. Pilots talk about load masters and standard pallet sizes. Infantry leaders describe the way thermal signatures change across a slope at sunrise. These are the sorts of specifics that indicate some witnesses are describing actual, technically framed observations rather than symbolic or jokey stories. On the other hand, technical jargon can also be a double-edged sword. It lends an air of authority that might obscure the gaps in direct evidence. For example, an analyst describing a 3-meter-tall thermal contact with 4 distinct heat lobes is giving useful data, but those lobes could be misread as limbs rather than tents or stacked bundles when the footage is low resolution. We also need to account for the pattern of claims that follow the story's circulation. The initial pilot's account was modest, pallet dimensions a heavy load. Later narrators layered in more emphatic biological anomalies and cultural details. That sequence matters because later informants may have been exposed to earlier accounts and perhaps unintentionally grafted elements onto their own recollections. Some testimonies, however, predate the pilot's interview and are independent of the public attention cycle, which complicates a simple explanation that this is mass suggestion or rumor amassed after a single sensational story. Distinguishing independent corroboration from echo is one of the central challenges here. The variety of witness types is striking. Men who fly heavy-lift helicopters, analysts who sit in dimly lit trailers peering at thermal feeds, infantry leaders who scrubbed through canyons with night vision goggles, and local interpreters. Each brings a different vantage point and different kinds of expertise. A pilot speaks to load handling, an FMV analyst to pixel interpretation, an infantry leader to direct engagement and the shape of combat. Together, they form a mosaic that, while incomplete, creates a pattern unlikely to emerge from a single isolated exaggeration. That doesn't prove the most extraordinary readings of the pattern. It simply flags that multiple independent professional observers reported something unusual at roughly the same stretch of geography and time windows. There is also the possibility of misidentification at scale. Afghanistan's terrain is full of surprises. Tall camouflage tarps, stacked irrigation pipe setments, or even natural rock formations can, at distance or through a thermal lens, suggest anthropomorphic shapes. Names of local animal species, ibex, wild asses, or reedy camels, can be misread.
Even simple transport of large carcasses such as yak or camel could, under certain conditions, mimic the outline of a large humanoid when bundled or covered. These hypotheses don't make for a satisfying myth, but they are plausible and must be weighed against witness claims.
Conversely, the particular mix of alleged anatomical anomalies, double rows of teeth, extra digits, presents a problem for simple misidentification scenarios. Those claims either require a real, close look at tissue or the acceptance that human memory and storytelling have heavily modified the original events. Another variable to consider is the role of local folklore. The mountains around Kandahar carry decades of stories, some protective, some cautionary. Folk tales about dangerous outsiders, giants, and spirits are cross-cultural phenomena, and when foreigners enter a place with those tales already present, their observations filter through a cultural lens. Soldiers hear the stories, tell them among themselves, and the narrative becomes transnational. An Afghan folktale infused with a soldier's fear becomes a modern military anecdote, then migrates into online forums and radio programs where it meets new audiences who may possess no local context at all. The result is a hybrid narrative, half battlefield report, half myth. That doesn't rule out the possibility of a genuine anomalous encounter, but it demands that historians and investigators separate the cultural frame from sensory evidence. By the time I began to map these testimonies against one another, the story had accumulated what I would call clusters, groups of details that appear repeatedly across different sources. One cluster focuses on size and load, pallet dimensions, pilot weight impressions, feet measurements. A second cluster contains mobility and behavior, moving across ridgelines, bending to enter doors, tending fires. A third cluster centers on anatomy, hair color, extra digits, dental anomalies. These clusters don't perfectly overlap in every source, but their recurrence suggests that if no single report is flawless, there is nonetheless a non-random concentration of similar observations across independent accounts. At this point in the narrative, a reader or listener might reasonably ask, why would military personnel risk reputational damage to report something so outlandish? The answer is complicated. On one hand, soldiers are trained to report the unusual. Military reporting channels incentivize documentation. On the other hand, the social cost of sounding ridiculous discourages public disclosure of odd experiences. The fact that multiple sources have chosen to speak, some under anonymity, some in interviews, suggests that the story resonates deeply within certain professional communities, even if they prefer to phrase it cautiously. That tension between professional obligation and reputational risk is part of what makes the accounts feel authentic in a human sense. People don't invent self-damage for a sensational headline. As I collected more interviews, a new problem presented itself. Sometimes the same event is described with different timelines.
A patrol leader who swore the incident occurred in late 2001 or early 2002 would place it in a different operational context than an aviation crew who said their pickup happened months later. These discrepancies don't invalidate the accounts. They do force us to acknowledge uncertainty and keep open the possibility that we are looking at multiple, perhaps distinct incidents rather than a single canonical Kandahar giant event. I treat those variations as data, not noise. They show how memory, administrative record-keeping, and the fog of war conspire to make precise reconstruction difficult. One of the most intriguing categories of testimony comes from FME analysts, who described encounters where the scale of the contact seemed outsized relative to the surrounding architecture. An analyst who asked to remain unnamed told me they watched a clip where a silhouette approached a courtyard and the contact's head and shoulders towered above the doorway. The analyst's language was technical. I adjusted the sensor range, and the contact scaled at approximately 3 to 4 meters based on doorframe assumptions. That last caveat, doorframe assumptions, is crucial. Analysts often have to infer height by comparing unknown objects to assumed standards. When structures are improvised and lacking calibrated dimensions, the resulting height calculations are only as reliable as the assumptions behind them. In short, the analyst's careful professional methodology produced a height estimate that was suggestive but not conclusive. As I spoke with more veterans, a recurrent theme emerged about how the landscape itself seemed to shelter stories. Mountains hide, both physically and socially. People go into ravines and do not return, which is the very texture that gives rise to local tales. One interpreter told a veteran to stay away from the Red Rock, not in the tone of a mythmaker, but as a practical warning rooted in a long-standing communal knowledge of danger zones. Those warnings can take on added meaning when foreign forces begin to search those places and then report back surprising findings. The valley remembers, even if the record does not. At this juncture, the narrative begins to bifurcate into two pathways.
the accumulation of witness testimony, and the rigorous scrutiny of the mechanisms by which witnesses arrived at their conclusions. The first pathway continues to yield striking, if sometimes contradictory, details: pilots who remember a heavy load strapped under a Chinook, operators who swear by unusual heat signatures, and a handful of ground troops who insist they saw an oversized humanoid felled by close-quarters weapons. The second pathway raises methodological flags: sensor limits, misidentification risks, social reinforcement of narrative elements, and the lack of a verifiable chain of custody for any alleged remains.
The story would be incomplete without acknowledging a line of speculation that has gained traction in some corners, that the government, or some interested entity, might have an institutional reason to suppress or obscure a retrieval. I don't dismiss the idea out of hand, because secrecy is a real feature of military operations. But to move from plausible institutional discretion to a claim of a deliberate, organized cover-up requires evidence, and so far the public record contains only absence: a DoD statement that it has no record or information supporting a retrieval, and multiple veterans' recollections of informal requests for quiet. The sensible middle ground is this: some participants said they were told to be quiet, but the absence of a documented chain of custody in public archives leaves the question unresolved and open to further inquiry. Where does that leave us after the first wave of testimonies and the subsequent more detailed recollections? We are standing at the edge of a story that refuses to sit entirely in the domain of folklore or military procedure. There are professionals who provided technically framed observations, civilians and interpreters whose cultural knowledge colors certain details, and veterans who insist, often reluctantly, that they encountered something large and unusual. The accounts form a lattice of data points that is neither conclusive proof nor easily dismissed as collective fantasy. As the narrative unfolds, there are two tightly entangled tasks that remain. First, to continue collecting and cross-checking independent testimonies, seeking corroborating physical evidence where possible, and clearer documentary records where they exist. Second, to subject each technical claim to scrutiny in light of sensor capabilities and human perception under stress. Those tasks demand patience and a careful weighing of probabilities, rather than an appetite for sensational conclusions. The next cluster of interviews I will walk through digs deeper into the FMV and optical operator accounts, interweaving more technical explanations of sensor limitations and presenting a tighter chronology as best as it can be reconstructed. Along the way, we'll revisit the pilot's pallet description with diagrams and modern load capacity numbers to see how plausible his weight estimates are, and we'll juxtapose that with the operator testimony that claims to have seen behaviors, bending into a hut, tending fires, that are hard to reconcile with simple misidentification. We will also examine the social dynamics that cause details like red hair or double rows of teeth to appear in later narratives, and whether those details are likely to be the product of close observation or the amplification of an already extraordinary story. But before moving into that more technical terrain, it's worth lingering on a human detail. The men and women who have told these stories repeatedly stress their discomfort with how the anecdotes have been used.
Many asked me to frame their accounts soberly. Their hesitance is revealing. When trained observers use careful language, I saw, I estimated, it appeared to me, they are often trying to preserve the integrity of what they witnessed without letting the story mutate into myth. Respecting that impulse is part of the responsible investigation. And yet the human hunger for narrative closure presses onward. When someone says, "We found shredded gear and then something charged us," the mind seeks an answer and often latches onto the most dramatic interpretation. Our job, as investigators and listeners, is to separate what is reported from what is inferred and to treat each with the appropriate level of skepticism. There is one final thread to pick up before we proceed deeper. Several former analysts and operators independently told me that when they reviewed thermal clips for reporting purposes, they routinely annotated footage with confidence brackets: high confidence, medium confidence, low confidence, based on pixel clarity, range, atmospheric conditions, and corroborating visual imagery. None of those analysts claimed to have footage that would score high confidence on those brackets with respect to anatomy. Several did claim the footage was compelling enough to warrant official attention, or at least a filed report. That tells us something important. The footage and eyewitness reports often landed in bureaucratic reporting channels, but filed report is not the same as public confirmation. Officials may have read a report and then found the data insufficient to trigger a formal investigative launch. And when a formal launch does not occur, the narrative sometimes migrates to the public sphere anyway, carried by individuals who perceive the silence as a kind of omission. So far, we've moved from caves with shredded gear to airborne lifts, from pilot impressions to operator recollections, and from cultural color to hard-to-reconcile anatomical claims. The scene is set and the players are on board. Human witnesses from multiple technical backgrounds, Apache paper trail, and official denial in the public record, and a set of repeated descriptive clusters that neither confirm nor fully explain the phenomenon. The next stage of this investigation will trace specific FMV clips and the analysts who reviewed them, comparing sensor metadata and atmospheric conditions where available, and will examine the implications of pallet dimensions and helicopter handling on the allegedly retrieved body. We'll also bring in linguistic analysis of the oral traditions and the social processes that transform battlefield reports into enduring legends. Until we take that deeper dive, the central fact remains: a set of credible-sounding witnesses, each with different professional stakes and sensory tools, insist they encountered or observed something outside ordinary experience.
Their accounts are neither uniform nor fully corroborated by hard public evidence, but they are persistent. The persistence is what keeps the question alive. Were these isolated misperceptions shaped by stress and culture, or do the repeated patterns hide an anomalous reality that demands direct physical evidence? The answer is not yet in hand. The evidence is a tangle. What follows is an attempt to tease that tangle apart. What follows is a closer look at the FMV and optical operator testimony, the people who spend hours watching pixels and thermal blips, and an attempt to place the more startling claims against what sensors can actually show. Several analysts and operators described clips that, at first glance, appear to support the larger-than-human readings from ground crews, but their descriptions also illuminate the many ways a confident-sounding height or anatomical detail can be an artifact of tools, assumptions, or distance. An FMV analyst who asked to remain unnamed recounted watching a clip in which a silhouetted figure crossed a courtyard and, in their reading, towered above a low doorway. Their procedure was methodical. They froze the frame, compared the contact's head-to-shoulder height against the doorway, and produced an estimated range, roughly 3 to 4 meters, based on what they assumed the doorframe must be. They emphasized that the calculation was conditional. If that door is a normal height, the contact scales like something between 9 and 13 feet. That caveat, if, is essential. In many Afghan compounds, door heights and construction standards are improvisational. What looks like a door to someone trained in architecture may be an opening made lower or higher than typical Western measurements. Analysts regularly use architectural elements as informal rulers when no better reference exists, and those informal rulers can produce large errors when the underlying assumption is wrong. Another analyst described the way pixel bloom can turn two small adjacent heat sources into the appearance of a single elongated body. In low-resolution thermal imagery, warm objects bleed into neighboring pixels. A tightly clustered group of people, a fire near a canvas bundle, or stacked animals covered with a tarp heated by the afternoon sun can present as an extended vertical hot trace on playback. The operator explained it simply. When pixel size is big compared to the target, you stop seeing anatomy and start seeing blobs. Then the brain does the rest. That rest, the pattern-matching impulse of a human observer, can be powerful, especially when an operator is primed by rumors or prior reports. Reaper operators I've spoken with offered a similar mixture of specificity and caution. One former Reaper sensor operator said they observed contacts at night that were, quote, taller than the surrounding shepherds and appeared to move differently. We filed a report.
They added that when they returned later to re-examine the clip with different display palettes and zoom settings, the contact's outline shifted, sometimes taller, sometimes less so, depending on angle and sensor range. This variability is not evidence of malintent, it's a technical reality. Sensors measure energy, and the processing pipeline reconstructs shapes from limited data. Operators are trained to annotate the confidence level of a contact for that very reason, because a single clip can suggest different things under different playback conditions. A particularly striking account comes from a ground-level observer who said he watched a figure bend to pass through a low doorway, movement an 8 to 12-foot tall being would seemingly find difficult without crouching. The observer's note was precise. The contact paused, flexed at what appeared to be the knees and hips, and the shoulders came under the lintel as it ducked through. That sort of behavior, if accurately perceived, is significant because it implies joint articulation and proportions inconsistent with most forms of bundled or misread debris. Yet here again, eyewitness distance and vantage matter. From a distance, a person entering a doorway with an overhanging tarp could appear to bend in an exaggerated way. A camera angle that foreshortens the image can make ordinary motion seem extraordinary. The operator was candid. I believed what I saw, but the pixel size and angle forced me to bracket my confidence. The Australian lieutenant's account adds a different sensory strand.
On picket duty, he tracked a thermal contact across ridgelines and estimated his height at roughly 12 feet from an optical spotting scope and handheld laser rangefinder. He emphasized the behavior more than just the size. The contact moved deliberately and seemed to use the terrain differently than goats or shepherds. Laser rangefinders, when used correctly, offer accurate distance readings. Combine that with an optical target of known approximate size, and you can produce a robust height estimate. The lieutenant's reading, therefore, carries a particular weight because it involved two independent measures, the optical image and the rangefinder. Still, he acknowledged uncertainties. At long range, atmospheric distortion and mirage can alter perceived size and motion. He framed his testimony as professional judgment rather than incontrovertible proof. Taken together, these operator and analyst accounts illustrate how the tools of aerial surveillance both reveal and conceal. Thermal imagery is excellent at showing living heat against a colder background. Daytime FMV can show color and texture, but loses clarity with distance. Neither is a perfect truth machine.
Two practical effects are worth stressing for anyone trying to reconcile these reports. First, ground sample distance, or the practical size of a pixel on the ground, matters enormously. Second, reference assumptions, door frame height, pallet size, door width, drive many of the height estimates. When someone says it was 3 meters tall, what they sometimes mean is it's scaled to 3 meters if you accept X as a standard. That conditionality is not a debunking gesture, it is how remote sensing works. That technical context loops us back to the most concrete physical claim in the chain, the palletized load described by the anonymous CH-47 pilot in 2008. His figures, pallet roughly 9 by 7 feet, cumbersome weight, resonate because a pallet is a known physical reference. Several witnesses echoed similar pallet dimensions and handling difficulties, producing a cluster of testimony that is harder to dismiss as pure misreading. Pilots and loadmasters are, by training and necessity, tactile judges of weight. They know the feel of a slung load, and an abnormally heavy and awkward pallet is something they'll remember. The question then becomes not whether a heavy, odd pallet was moved, multiple witnesses say it was, but what exactly was on that pallet. The pilot's visual estimates of feet measuring in the range of 28 to 30 inches and a gross weight into the low thousands of pounds create an image that invites forensic analysis. If a body existed matching those descriptions, forensic examination should have left paper trails, mortuary records, pathology notes, transfer manifests. None of those documents have entered the public record. The Department of Defense stated it had no record or information supporting a retrieval of that sort, which is itself a statement of absence that has to be weighed against multiple oral reports claiming something else. It's a classic evidentiary duality, strong-sounding human testimony on one side and an absence of documentary corroboration on the other. Chain of custody is the next technical problem. A recovered body is not just an observation, it's evidence that must be logged, photographed, tested, and tracked if it is to have scientific or legal value. Many veterans told me they had heard rumors of binding non-disclosure agreements or instructions to refrain from public discussion. Several said they had been told to keep quiet by their chain of command. Some reported that videos had been pulled from public access. Those are serious claims, but they are also the kinds of claims that can be easy to amplify. An informal request to avoid speculation from a commander can become, in retelling, a sealed legal order. Where possible, I asked for specifics, dates, names, written orders. Most could not provide them. That absence does not reduce the gravity of what the witnesses felt. It simply limits our ability to move from testimony to evidentiary fact. The missing media problem is significant.
Pulled footage is a common refrain in online communities debating these incidents. Operators and analysts told me versions of the same story. A clip that circulated in a small circle, then was no longer accessible. Digital disappearance has multiple causes: routine takedowns for operational security, loss of data due to poor archival practices, or intentional removal. Without the clip, independent verification is effectively impossible. Analysts emphasized that a high-confidence assessment requires original files and metadata, timestamps, sensor logs, cross-referenced GPS coordinates. What circulates as a compressed, re-uploaded video on a public website is rarely sufficient for forensic analysis. In other words, absence of an accessible clip is not proof of a cover-up. It's often a function of how the military handles and preserves operational feeds and how quickly digital artifacts degrade in an ad hoc archive. Beyond sensors and pallets, the anatomical claims demand special scrutiny because they carry the most extraordinary burden. Reports of double rows of teeth or 6 fingers appear in a smaller number of testimonies and often in the most sensational retellings. Those details are the sort that, if true, should leave durable physical traces: dental records, pathology reports, or at least photographs that could be authenticated. To date, I have not seen a verified tissue sample, pathology report, or authenticated imagery that supports such anatomical anomalies.
Several witnesses insisted that they had observed odd dental features up close, while others described hearing about such details secondhand. That distinction is critical. Direct tactile contact carries far more evidentiary weight than repeating a rumor from a comrade. Two alternative explanations for anatomical claims deserve careful consideration. The first is misperception under stress. A soldier examining a damaged body in poor light might mistake trauma, dental prostheses, or dental disease for an anomalous arrangement of teeth. The second is cultural cross-pollination. Once an evocative detail, red hair, unusual digits, enters a narrative, it is easily transmitted and amplified because it is memorable. That amplification process explains why certain specific images recur in multiple accounts. They make a story stick. Memory researchers call this schema-based reconstruction. People reconstruct memories to fit an understandable frame. The best way to separate these possibilities is to find physical evidence with a documented chain of custody. Without it, the anatomical claims remain intriguing but unverified. At the same time, it would be a mistake to reduce all reports to error. There are credible patterns that resist easy dismissal. Multiple independently situated witnesses, pilots, analysts, infantry leaders, and an Australian lieutenant, reported unusually large thermal or visual contacts in roughly the same geographic and temporal band.
The behavioral details, movement along ridgelines, tending of fires, entering compounds, appear across roles that would otherwise have little reason to collude. Those cross-domain consistencies are the reason the story keeps attracting attention among both veterans and investigators. You do not typically see the same strange shape described by a sensor operator in a trailer, a pilot on a flight line, and a trooper on a ridge unless something real is being observed, or unless the narrative has migrated widely and been retrofitted into multiple accounts. So where does that leave the more fantastic possibilities? Hypotheses range from the mundane to the conspiratorial. Tall, bundled carcasses misread as humanoid, improvised structures casting human-like thermal silhouettes, hoaxed staged for attention, or for the less parsimonious, an actual biological anomaly that would shock existing scientific frameworks. Each hypothesis has consequences for what one would expect to find in the archive. Misidentification predicts a scattering of inconsistent reports, few if any authenticated forensic records, and likely subsequent corrections. Hoaxed predicts a small number of originators with motivation and a trail of retractions or admissions. An actual anomalous organism would predict hard physical traces, tissue, pathology, official handling, somewhere in the chain, even if some players were compelled to silence. We also have to account for the social and cultural scaffolding that shapes interpretation. Folk tales and local warnings can prime soldiers to see the unusual in certain places. My conversations with interpreters and long-resident locals revealed dozens of regional tales about dangerous ridgelines and night creatures, stories intended to keep children close to home and travelers wary. Those tales are not evidence of biological oddities, but they are cultural lenses through which ambiguous sensory data can be read. If a sensor operator is already aware of a giant story circulating in his unit, they may unconsciously interpret a hard-to-read thermal contact through that narrative frame. This is a human, not a nefarious process. Another human dynamic is the defensive posture of military institutions. When confronted with a claim that veers into the extraordinary, organizations often default to procedural caution, file a report, assess internally, and refrain from public comment until they have a working hypothesis. That posture can look like silence to the outside world and fuel speculation that something is being covered up. Yet in many cases, that silence is bureaucratic inertia or a judgment that the available data fail to meet thresholds for wider disclosure. Having repeatedly asked military spokespeople about these accounts, I can only report what the public record contains. The Department of Defense stated it had no record or information supporting a retrieval of a non-standard body from Afghanistan.
What we do have is a cluster of oral histories and some operational reports that, on their own, do not create the kind of documentary chain required to challenge that public statement. In weighing the credibility of the overall pattern, I return to a principle that many of the witnesses themselves invoked. Professionals who talk in calibrated terms are worth listening to, but their statements must be judged by the standards of their professions. An FMV analyst's medium confidence annotation means something different than a headline writer's breathless assertion. Pilots and loadmasters have tangible ways of knowing when a cargo behaves oddly in flight, and their recollections of a heavy, awkward pallet are analytically useful even if they do not identify the pallet's contents.
Conversely, vivid but late-emerging anatomical descriptions that lack corroborating physical evidence should be treated as candidate revisions rather than established fact. To put it plainly, we have a lattice of testimony that is suggestive but not dispositive. The most defensible claims in this lattice are procedural and sensory. Multiple operators and pilots reported unusual heat signatures and heavy, awkward palletized loads. At least a few ground troops reported encountering shredded gear and bodily remains that did not match standard battlefield damage. The less defensible claims are biological particulars, extra digits, double rows of teeth, because they lack corroborating physical evidence and, in some cases, appear in later retellings that post-date the public airing of earlier accounts. To put it plainly, we have a lattice of testimony that is suggestive but not dispositive. The most defensible claims in this lattice are procedural and sensory. Multiple operators and pilots reported unusual heat signatures and heavy, awkward palletized loads. At least a few ground troops reported encountering shredded gear and bodily remains that did not match standard battlefield damage. The less defensible claims are biological particulars, extra digits, double rows of teeth, because they lack corroborating physical evidence and, in some cases, appear in later retellings that post-date the public airing of earlier accounts. To put it plainly, we have a lattice of testimony that is suggestive but not dispositive. The most defensible claims in this lattice are procedural and sensory. Multiple operators and pilots reported unusual heat signatures and heavy, awkward palletized loads. At least a few ground troops reported encountering shredded gear and bodily remains that did not match standard battlefield damage. The less defensible claims are biological particulars, extra digits, double rows of teeth, because they lack corroborating physical evidence and, in some cases, appear in later retellings that post-date the public airing of earlier accounts. To put it plainly, we have a lattice of testimony that is suggestive but not dispositive. The most defensible claims in this lattice are procedural and sensory. Multiple operators and pilots reported unusual heat signatures and heavy, awkward palletized loads. At least a few ground troops reported encountering shredded gear and pilots reported encountering heavy, awkward palletized loads. At least a few ground troops reported encountering heavy, awkward palletized loads. At least a few ground troops reported encountering heavy, awkward palletized loads.
That discomfort explains why a story like the Kandahar reports moves quickly from guarded filing cabinets into late-night radio and internet forums. The absent evidence frustrates the impulse for closure. The result is a cultural tug-of-war between curiosity, skepticism, and the hunger for a definitive answer. Cultural and historical parallels, Nephilim, Goliath, Rephaim, have been invoked by commentators and occasionally by witnesses themselves as shorthand to describe an experience of being dwarfed by another presence. From an investigative standpoint, those parallels are useful as literary devices, but hazardous as evidentiary anchors. They explain why certain images, red hair, extra digits, titanic height, are so mimetic and enduring, but they do not provide scientific evidence. I present them only to show how human cognition maps ancient archetypes onto modern sensory anomalies, thereby making certain narratives easier to accept and harder to discard. So, where does the balance of probabilities lie? It is tempting to take a binary position, either dismiss this as folklore or treat it as a suppressed discovery. Neither is warranted by the available data. What the evidence more reasonably supports is a middle course. Something unusual was repeatedly observed in a set of clustered reports. The observations are distributed across credible observers in different roles. The technical constraints and lack of verifiable physical evidence prevent an unequivocal conclusion. In short, compelling testimony, insufficient public proof. That unresolved quality is itself noteworthy. It is unusual for clusters of military observers to report consistent large anomalies and for there to be no documented follow-up of at least some kind, internal memos, investigative notes, or declassified advisories. The absence of those items in public records could mean any number of things: inadequate archiving, classification, or simply that the reports did not meet the threshold for a broader inquiry. It is also possible that different incidents have been conflated over time, separate encounters folded into a single, more coherent narrative. All of these are plausible, and none are definitively proved. In the end, the story that began with shredded gear at cave mouths and the palletized load beneath the Chinook raises an enduring epistemic question that extends beyond these specific reports. How should we treat professional testimony that points towards the extraordinary in the absence of physical proof? My answer, informed by interviews and technical consultation, is this:
Treat the testimony with respect, apply rigorous standards of verification, and resist the temptation to substitute emotion for evidence. These are not mutually exclusive acts. You can honor the lived reality of witnesses, many of whom still wrestle privately with what they saw, while also insisting on the higher bar that turns anecdote into demonstrable fact.
The accounts I examined are by turns plausible, puzzling, and provocative. They are also, crucially, unresolved. For some listeners, that will be frustrating. For others, it will be a prompt to demand better access to primary files and to pressure institutions to be more transparent about how anomalous reports are handled. For now, the unbelievable tales label fits because multiple professional observers reported experiences outside everyday explanation, yet public documentation that would move those reports into the category of verified anomaly is absent. If you find this subject compelling and want to explore the primary interviews, annotated sources, and a full transcript of the testimonies referenced here, those materials are linked in the episode notes and on our website. I'll also be following up with deeper dives into specific FMV clips and with interviews of additional analysts who can speak to sensor metadata and archiving practices. If you want to see that work continue, the best way to support it is to check the links in the description, share this investigation with someone interested in military mysteries, and return for the next episode where we attempt to trace as much of the primary record as still exists. For now, we are left with a set of persistent, professional-sounding observations that challenge easy explanation, but do not, on their own, justify the strongest interpretive claims. The mountains around Kandahar hold stories. The sensors and people sent to watch them caught patterns that deserve scrutiny. Whether those patterns ultimately prove to be misperception, cultural echo, hoax, or something genuinely anomalous remains open. That openness is not a failure of reporting. It is the honest endpoint of an investigation constrained by the limits of available evidence and the rigor of method. The tale, unbelievable to some, credible to others, stands as an invitation. If you have verifiable material, now is the moment to bring it forward. Until then, the question remains.